Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to hold for a couple minutes to let people log on. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today for the third of PRA's summer webinar series. For those of you who are new to PRA, Political Research Associates is a national nonprofit nearing its 40th year. PRA provides research, analysis, and strategic recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision for feminist multiracial democracy. To learn more about our work, visit politicalresearch.org. Today we have our webinar Under the Cover of COVID, featuring Ben Lorber and Cloee Cooper, PRA research analysts, and Tobita Chow, Director of Justice is Global, a project of People's Actions and People's Action Institute. Ben is going to start us off today. Ben, if you're ready, we can hit the ground running.
Okay, great. Thanks, Koki. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk today about how the right has responded to the COVID crisis by mobilizing anti-Semitism, and why this is dangerous for Jews, immigrants, Asian Americans, and multiracial democracy itself. And some of what I'm saying is pulled from a piece on the PRA website called The Globalist Within. So when the COVID crisis kicked off, white nationalists and far-right public figures constructed a narrative that a shadowy elite cabal of globalists had stabbed the US in the back, and that this was the root cause of the US's vulnerability to COVID and the ensuing economic collapse. In doing so, the right was able to wed anti-China nationalism, which we'll hear about soon from Toby, together with anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant racism to build a powerful narrative frame that was used to distract from the Trump administration's massive mishandling of the crisis and to foreclose the possibility of a robust public health response, but by instead distracting blame and attention onto familiar scapegoats. And this anti-globalist frame is not going away on the nationalist right. Next slide, please. So how did this start, right? As early as March 2nd, when the COVID crisis was just beginning, President Trump stated at a rally that he was proud to, quote, close our borders very early from certain parts of the world, i.e. China, in response to COVID-19. And he slammed the, quote, fringe globalists who would rather keep our borders open than keep our infection rates down. So quickly, voices across the far right amplified these nationalist themes that have long been core to the Trump presidency. They insisted that the spread of the virus across national borders stood as proof that the whole globalist world system of interconnected nations, of immigration, of open borders was a disaster for humanity and could not protect Americans from the virus. Similar arguments were deployed by the European far right. Basically, the global far right in the month of March rejoiced that many countries decided to temporarily close their borders to control the spread of the virus. They thought that this was a historic victory and a rebuke against globalism. As British Brexiteer Nigel Farage said on March 12th, we are all nationalists now. At this time, white nationalists and the organized anti-immigrant movement used the crisis to try to push their policy goals of a complete immigration moratorium under the banner of anti-globalism. And white nationalists and other voices on the far right advanced similar racist arguments that a globalist culture of political correctness held the US back from decisively naming the threat from China, a theme that they continue today, and that, quote, globalist multiculturalism kept the American people from responding as a cohesive and decisive nation. Next slide, please. So at the same time as the COVID crisis began to deepen, the far right used anti-globalism language also to advance an economic nationalist agenda. Far right America First politicians like Trump, and Republicans like Matt Gaetz and Josh Hawley, you know, pundits like Fox News' Tucker Carlson, key White House advisors like Peter Navarro, as well as white nationalists, claimed that because globalist, you know, corporate and economic elites had spent decades outsourcing key industries and jobs in the US to global supply chains and to competitors like China, the US couldn't manufacture its own medical supplies in this time, like N95 masks and respirators. And that left the US, you know, dependent for its very survival upon rivals like China and upon a world system in crisis. And according to this argument, right, the globalists who were responsible for this were the enemy within, a shadowy elite cabal who had quietly subverted the American economy from behind the scenes, right, leaving the nation weak and humiliated, you know, playing on these common far-right themes of the need for national renewal, right? Far-right pundits and President Trump quickly called on the US to withdraw from globalist and international bodies like the World Health Organization, which they claimed had undermined American sovereignty. Right-wing pundits also use these economic anti-globalist arguments to strike a populist tone against corporate greed. For example, anti-immigrant commentator Michelle Malkin exclaimed, "No bailouts for the globalist airline industry," at the time when the airlines were calling for bailouts. And as I'll return to in a moment, these populist polemics against greedy globalist economic elites really have the potential to resonate powerfully for millions of Americans hurt by economic strife and eager for someone to blame. Next slide, please. So finally, as right-wing protests against lockdowns and public safety measures continue to spread across the country in May, anti-globalist rhetoric remained front and center. Within a network of fast-growing Facebook groups at the state and county level, you know, calling for the reopening, every named enemy of the movement was deemed a globalist, from Democratic state governors to public health officials like Dr. Anthony Fauci. This shows really how thoroughly anti-globalist rhetoric had penetrated into this activist base of the right. You know, conspiracism on outlets like One American News Network centered around, you know, globalists, the deep state, you know, cabal of folks like George Soros and Bill Gates and other familiar targets who had, you know, supposedly engineered the virus to take down American sovereignty and President Trump. So this conspiracism hampered any sober public health response, and again, distracted blame from the Trump administration. And this continued into the present. Next slide, please. Now, it's crucial to note that at the same time as the mainstream right was going on about the globalist agenda, the same rhetoric was being championed by white nationalists. The white nationalist site VDare, claimed, quote, globalism and China are the disease, nationalism and America first are the cure. The white nationalist site Occidental Observer said, the real disease here isn't COVID-19, it is globalism. And unlike COVID-19, globalism does have an antidote, white nationalism. White nationalists were very conscious that they could use this narrative frame to go into mainstream right spaces and recruit new adherents. For example, Patrick Casey, leader of the white nationalist American Identity Movement, urged his followers in March. He said that we're in a moment that a lot of people are beginning to realize that globalism not only caused the spread of this disease, but exacerbated it. Now it's more important for us than ever, to get out there and ensure that the people who don't fully get it are brought on board. And in case I haven't said that yet, this globalist frame on the far right is saturated with anti-Semitism. It repackages the familiar trope of the international Jew, a conspiracy of subversive, all-powerful international elites who are concentrated at the heights of governments, financial, cultural institutions, right? Engineering exploitation and advancing liberal causes to ensure dominance and widespread suffering, right? And of course, anti-globalism was far from the only anti-Semitic frame in play during the first few months of the COVID crisis. Numerous far-right figures blamed George Soros for supposedly engineering the virus to bring down Trump and establish a new world order, etc. White nationalists, blamed Jews outright for COVID and showed up at protests with signs trying to spread that message. At least one white nationalist planned to blow up a hospital until he was intercepted by authorities, and he had previous plans to blow up a synagogue and a mosque. And we know that this is how anti-Semitism functions, right? Both from the organized white nationalist movement and from the institutional right. It offers a conspiratorial caricature of the elites to tap into popular discontent in a time of crisis, to deflect blame away from the real systems and leaders who uphold inequality. Last slide, please. So we're in a moment when the right is able to use anti-globalism, as I said, to tap into real suffering that millions are facing right now under economic, collapse. They take some real criticisms of neoliberalism that have been long articulated by progressives, who have long criticized the exploitative and profit-driven free trade model, the outsourcing of industries and living wage jobs, right? They package these valid critiques of neoliberal globalization and they bring them on to the right to mobilize millions behind an exclusionary ultranationalist project. And my final point, I know I'm out of time, is that we're in a moment right now when more than ever the center cannot hold, right? The economic and social dislocation caused by COVID combined with the resentment unleashed in portions of white communities in reaction to the massively transformative BLM protests have added to the fuel that will likely lead to a growth in white nationalist and far-right organizing in this time, again, under the banner of a crusade against corrupt globalist elites. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to questions and to further conversation about this.
Thank you, Ben. Cloee, when you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here with everyone today. And it was wonderful to hear that presentation, Ben. Today, I'm going to be talking about another sector of the right, the Patriot Movement County Sheriffs, and how they are dealing with this public crisis. Go ahead, slide, please. So just to give some context here, the Patriot Movement that I follow is complex. It's a loose network of organized militia, law enforcement, particularly sheriffs. It has ties to the sovereign citizens movement that was most active in the 1990s, and generally promotes a kind of right-wing decentralization, particularly regarding the economy and federal regulations. A lot of this decentralization actually kind of connects very well to what Ben was just describing in terms of oftentimes the promotion of ideas around mobilizing resentment against so-called globalists, and kind of conflating any type of state or federal regulations with tyranny. But while this Patriot movement has some ties with the anti-government, white supremacists, posse comitatus, there's also a relationship that is had with the right-wing Mormon political networks. And the Patriot movement, because of this, is sometimes not easy to pin down. And while Ben spoke about the kind of white nationalist right, I would say the Patriot movement embraces much more of a colorblind politics around race, and often intersects with a broader group of the right, including libertarians, because of this. But their flagship organization, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which has been around since the beginning of the first term of the Obama administration, has been kind of central within sheriff's departments in terms of promoting decentralization, including gun sanctuaries, but also defying state and federal laws, which has come out particularly recently in terms of sheriffs related to the constitutional sheriffs movement kind of being the leadership of defying statewide shelter-in-place orders. And just for some context in terms of this milieu, as we discuss how these sheriffs are actually relating to this public health crisis, is that the founder of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, Richard Mack, is actually also active in anti-vaxxer circles. So as I discuss this movement and some of their actions today, I want everyone to think not only about kind of what this alliance between sheriffs and militia and other sectors of the right is doing right now, which I want to dig into, but also how this alliance could mobilize in the future and for whom, especially as we look to the fall and to this upcoming election. I think this is going to be an important point of intersection that we will be continuing to follow closely. But today, I actually want to spend most of my time discussing this network of sheriffs, how they are dealing with the public health crisis of COVID-19 in their counties, and some of the challenges that we are finding in terms of how specifically their ideology is relating to the incredible crisis that's happening inside of county jails. So you can move to the next slide, please, thanks. You know, here's a little bit of what we know. The Constitutional Sheriffs Movement, which we've been able to track at least 250 sheriffs around the country that are aligned with the Constitutional Sheriffs Movement. There are 3,081 sheriffs. So the Constitutional Sheriffs played somewhat of a significant role during the reopen movements. Part of the narrative that the Constitutional Sheriffs promoted actually was that COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders was part of a plot by an elitist and big government to kill small businesses. They also said that any type of shelter-in-place orders was a sign essentially of impending tyranny. And because of this, many of them came out with statements around the country to declare that they would not be enforcing the orders within their counties. We found, along with other groups that were following this trend closely, that actually over 60 sheriffs around the country came out to defy shelter-in-place orders. And these sheriffs were then propped up and asked to come speak at some of the reopen movements and demonstrations that were happening. But because we know that sheriffs are not only responsible for enforcing or not enforcing what's happening at the county level, but that they also oversee jails, we've been increasingly interested in looking at what their stances on COVID have been in terms of the upcoming outbreak inside of county jails. And just for further context, a third of the nation's total incarcerated people reside inside of county jails, which is about 738,000 people, and sheriffs oversee those jails. So one of the questions guiding this ongoing research is how these Patriot Movement sheriffs are actually responding to this crisis inside of county jails. And here's the challenge. Officials are keeping prisoners and the public kind of largely in the dark around the extent of COVID-19 inside of their facilities. And there is still very little actually publicly available data on the numbers of people who have contracted the virus inside of jails. Also, because of jails where people are coming in and out, there's been increasing evidence that shows that jails are playing a very large role in increasing the rates of the pandemic, both inside the jails and in the counties at large. And while we are continuing to look at this, one of the big issues that is ongoing is that in many cases, the sheriffs are not even forced to actually keep the numbers. And so there is a new effort that's happening with some incredible research that's happening at UCLA, at the New York University as well, to begin actually doing a more massive tracking of cases and outbreaks inside of county jails. And what we've found so far is that many of the sheriffs that we are looking at are definitely of the sheriffs that are currently not only not decarcerating in their jails, but have actually unfortunately increased the numbers of people inside of their jails during this pandemic. And so take for example, Sheriff Leon Wilmot of Yuma County in Arizona, which borders the US-Mexico border. This is a sheriff who has been a part of the Constitutional Sheriffs Network, actually sits on the National Sheriffs Association's Board of Directors, and along with a host of other sheriffs, visited the Trump White House in February of 2019, urging him and Congress to enforce border security. At the time, he was so concerned with the incursion of undocumented people across the border and how that was increasing crime in his county. Yes, there is a list of sheriffs. And when it came to COVID back in June, he had released a statement saying that he would not enforce mask requirements in his county. And this was at just hours after the Yuma County Board of Supervisors had passed a proclamation mandating masks or covering in public places. He basically goes on to say that he will not divert any manpower from emergency services to conduct face covering enforcement. And you kind of have to wonder how somebody who has that level of authority, what he is calling an actual emergency. A recent report found that there was in fact an outbreak in his county jail, that at the very least, they've been able to find 17 reported cases, including one member of his staff. And so far, he says that he's taking some of the stances that he needs in order to kind of help curb this. But the recent numbers that I was able to track down is that not only has he not decarcerated, the population inside of his jail has actually increased since January of 2020. And we know that right now, in terms of what's getting reported, the numbers that are getting reported are dismally lower than the numbers that are actually getting than the actual number that's happening inside of the county jail. And another example that I found was in Texas, a constitutional sheriff that we've been tracking for some time just started doing testing of his inmates back in early July after finding that there had been a massive outbreak, and it was clear that there had been no prior testing in his jail before a massive outbreak occurred. I want to say that this is a new and emerging area of our research. It's, could you go to slide actually, please? Oh, there it goes, so previous slide. Thank you. And that there is an incredible effort that is happening across the board and across, unfortunately, many academic institutions to actually force and put pressure on increased data collection, and that it is clear that sheriffs who have an ideology that is underplaying the public health crisis and that essentially is connected to the Patriot movement and other far-right forces will be very ill-equipped to deal with this type of crisis inside of their jails. And it's something that PRA is going to continue to pay attention to, so please stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Toby, we will continue with you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Toby Chow. I use pronouns he, him, his, and I am the director of Justice is Global. Justice is Global is a project at People's Action focused on winning a just and sustainable global economy and defeating right-wing nationalism. And since the COVID-19 crisis hit us here in the US, we have shifted the focus of our project to developing a strategy to counter this increasing anti-China politics, the worsening US-China relationship, and what many are calling now a new Cold War between the US and China, which we think is extremely dangerous and volatile. So I'm gonna talk about some of the anti-China politics that we see on the right. Ben has touched on this already, and the role that that's playing within the Republican Party and the right as a whole under the COVID-19 moment. So this is from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's speech given at the Nixon Library in late July, titled "Communist China in the Free World's Future." A couple of key quotes from this speech. He said, "If we bend the knee now, our children's children may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party, and that securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time." So here, Pompeo is portraying an apocalyptic struggle, an existential struggle between the United States and China, in portraying China as an existential threat to the US and to our very way of life. It's a paranoid vision. It involves massively over-exaggerating the threat that China poses to just the average person in the United States. I think there are many valid critiques of the Chinese government, but it is absurd to say that China is threatening to take over the US and subjugate our children. Slide. This anti-China rhetoric has been a long time coming on the right. It has escalated massively since the start of the COVID-19 crisis. This is a shot from March when President Trump first started using the phrase Chinese virus to refer to the novel coronavirus, to identify it with China, and also to racialize it, to identify it with Chinese people, and then by extension, with Asian people in general, which has been a major feature of the COVID-19 crisis. Slide. This has been a major part of the electoral campaign strategy from Trump and from other Republicans. This is from BeijingBiden.com, which is run by America First PAC, the major PAC supporting Trump's reelection campaign, identifying Biden with China, saying that Biden is on the side of China and has betrayed the United States. Trump is the only one who can stand up for Americans and stand up to Biden and China. Slide. With the announcement of Kamala Harris as the running mate, they very quickly used these anti-China narratives against Harris as well. Here, they are using the fact that Senator Harris introduced a resolution opposing anti-Asian racism under the pandemic, and something that they consistently do around this is to say that if you criticize anti-Asian racism under the pandemic, you are actually doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party. So if you criticize the phrase Wuhan virus or Chinese virus, you're actually doing China's work for it. So you're on the side of China and undermining the United States. Slide. This is a take from Senator Josh Hawley, one of the chief right-wing nationalists in the Republican Senate, hitting a lot of the themes that Ben touched on. So China, globalism, Wall Street, Biden and Harris are siding with those forces and against real Americans and working people. And this should play automatically. Oh, go back. Okay. Oh, that's a pity. That's okay.
Because I was muted.
I don't win the.
Sorry.
Okay,
That's
great.
going again.
Look, China will own the United States if this election is lost by Donald Trump. If I don't win the election, China will own the United States. You're going to have to learn to speak Chinese.
Okay, so that's a nice, tight statement of how Trump and the Republican Party in general is portraying the stakes of this election. Slide. So this messaging strategy, this anti-China messaging strategy was formalized back in April, both by the Trump campaign and by the NRSC, the Senate Republicans. The messaging strategy has three central parts. One is blame China for the pandemic, and every bad thing that's coming out of the pandemic, that is all China's fault. 150,000 people dead in America. Those are people that China killed, that everything is to blame on China. Also blame China for other problems such as deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing jobs, the opioid epidemic. Those things are also things that we need to blame on China. So it's the first part, blame China. Second, accuse Democrats. So this is both Biden and Harris, but also down ballot, accuse Democrats of siding with China or being weak on China and betraying the country. And then third, promise that it is the Republican Party that is going to stand up to China and protect America against these Chinese threats. Oh, can we do the poll right now? Good question from Tarso. I believe it's Mandarin, which is the language, the official language of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a quick poll question if who has heard this messaging from election campaigns.
Hedini, are you able to see the results on your end?
Yeah, I am. About 50% have voted, so I'm just waiting for everyone to finish voting.
In the meantime, can we go to the next slide? So while we wait for those results to come in, this messaging has had an impact in terms of people's views on China. This is a graph of unfavorable versus favorable views on China. The number of people who view China in an unfavorable light has just gone up and up. It's skyrocketing since the beginning of the pandemic. The emergence of a pandemic from any global south country, any non-white country, is already fertile ground for xenophobia. And this messaging against China that we see coming from the right is just both tapping into that and using that while also feeding into it. So that's how we've seen this, this rise in anti-China sentiment at a popular level in the United States.
Toby, the results are in the chat if you'd like to share.
Okay, so most people have seen at least some of this anti-China messaging from election campaigns, and about a third of people say that they have seen quite a lot of it. Great, thank you, thank you. It varies in different parts of the country, I think, and depending what races are most important in each part of the country. Now let's go to the next slide. So another thing that we're seeing is using this anti-China messaging to cover as much of the progressive agenda as possible. So a couple of points that Trump hit in this press conference in the Rose Garden in mid-July. First, climate change politics are pro-China and anti-American. So he says Biden was a leading advocate for the Paris Climate Accord. It would have crushed American manufacturers, yet one more gift from Biden to the Chinese Communist Party. So if you believe in fighting climate change, you're anti-American, pro-Chinese. He also said the Democrats, want to defend our military when China is building a massive military. Biden wants to defend our military. So again, if you are in favor of cutting our bloated, immense military budget, you are pro-Chinese and anti-American. Slide. The right also portrays basically any effort to mitigate the pandemic as somehow innately Chinese. They will say that wearing a mask is a Chinese thing, that lockdowns are a Chinese thing, shutting down non-essential businesses, that is a Chinese thing, preventing houses of worship from meeting in person, that is Chinese. So all of this is just emanating from China, and our leaders are becoming vehicles to impose like communist Chinese culture on the United States. Slide. They also blamed Black Lives Matter on China, accusing China of being behind the protests. The second tweet from Raheem Kassam, he is a close collaborator of Steve Bannon, claiming that Black Lives Matter helps lay the groundwork for a Chinese Communist Party invasion. So just conspiratorial, paranoid vision of the threat of China. Slide. So this isn't just rhetoric. The Trump administration and also Republicans in Congress have taken a number of steps to antagonize China and poison the US-China relationship. And one read on this that I agree with is that they are trying to poison the US-China relationship so deeply that even if Biden and the Democrats take power in November, they will be unable to undo the damage, and the US and China will be locked in a spiraling conflict. And that is what they want. They believe that that is necessary, both in order to protect the United States against the supposed Chinese threat, and also because they believe correctly that anti-China politics is favorable political terrain for them. So if they can lock in this US-China conflict, that is going to pay off for them electorally down the road. Slide. Most terrifying potential outcome of this would be military conflict. This is a quote from Florida Representative Ted Yoho, predicting that we will see a US-China military clash before the end of the year. So this is something they're seriously contemplating. And slide. And lastly, have an article that I co-authored with my colleague Jake Werner in These Times magazine that goes into this and other issues in much more depth. It's not online yet, but it will be soon. Invite you to take a look at that and read more about it. And that's.
Great. Thank you so much, Toby. I invite audience to submit questions, and in the meantime, I invite our panelists to respond to each other's presentation, pull up any, raise any interesting corollaries. So whoever would like to take the first go.
I'm happy to. Yeah, thank you so much, Cloee and Toby. I learned a lot, as I'm sure we all did. And I guess one question that came to mind, Toby, I wonder if I feel like Sinophobia or anti-China, racism is similarly to anti-Semitism, is a kind of bigotry that often we aren't used to thinking about. And so I'm curious if you could say a little bit about, generally, and there seem to be a lot of parallels with xenophobia and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on those parallels, if you could tell us a little bit more about the history of xenophobia in this country.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of close parallels, and I know, like, for both of us, one of our inspirations in analyzing anti-Semitism is the work of Postone, who I think has done some of the best work on understanding anti-Semitism as sort of distorted right-wing version of anti-capitalism. It's like a distorted critique of capitalism that involves identifying Jews as sort of capitalism embodied. And I think that there's something very similar that happens with anti-Chinese and more generally anti-Asian racism of seeing, so right now I think that China is sort of taking the place of embodying these abstract and hidden forces of the global capitalist system, which, I mean, when you see China being identified with Wall Street or with the tech industry, which is a big right-wing nationalist talking point, I think that's some of how it plays out. So the identification of the ways that Jews are identified with these sort of abstract, hidden global conspiracies is a lot of parallels with what's happening with China right now. And I think like the roots of, you can see a history of how this goes back into the roots of anti-Asian racism as they developed in the 19th century, of just being sort of rootless, foreign, and very just this not quite human source of pure labor power. That was sort of the sources of anti-Asian racism, 19th century, and some of that is carried down to today.
Chloe, you just unmuted?
Yeah, I just wanted to actually jump off of that point for a minute, because I think what's interesting to me about the various areas of research that we all do, from looking at kind of global and geopolitical relationships to, in my case, looking like deep at what's happening at the county level, is that there is an alignment or a similarity, at least, in terms of, in some ways, almost embodying kind of a leftist politic, but replacing the enemy with various different types of things. And I think what's complex about the Patriot movement is that whom they see as the enemy definitely changes over time, and that there's many arguments that they make, let's say for county supremacy, or where they raise fears about too much government surveillance or too much government encroachment on people's lives, that really appeal to kind of working class interests, and yet have this very much of a populist appeal. And yet when you try to take it a few steps further, there's a close alignment with, you know, an idea that anybody supporting immigration is just supporting globalization and big businesses and trying to kill the like working class person. And ultimately they aren't fully for all working class people or multiracial democracy, but have this kind of idealized idea of a working person who's a producerist, who has business, and that they are trying to defend. So anyways, that's just a through line that I see in all of our presentations here that I think is interesting and troubling and kind of complex in terms of how it goes beyond just them, you know, being racist, but actually their appeals oftentimes to working class or to working people is something that I'm frightened about. And I'm curious, Ben, in terms of what you are seeing, how you are seeing these anti-Semitic appeals go beyond, let's say, the kind of organized right and get taken up by ordinary people and other just, you know, outside of these kind of organized networks.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. I really love what you just said there, and I appreciate that, you know, you were able to bring to this panel a really concrete example of the way that, you know, these conspiracy theories that, you know, can seem very abstract and ideological and kind of, you know, wacky, have real world, you know, impacts. Like they are directly, you know, motivating, you know, county sheriffs to, you know, to trap people in COVID jails in this moment, and, you know, they're fueling the detention of immigrants at the border, and so it's important to be reminded of some of the real world impacts upon, you know, on most vulnerable communities. And very briefly, I mean, one way that I've seen, you know, a version of what you could, you know, with, you know, some care, call a version of anti-Semitic conspiracism is in the popularity of the QAnon movement, which has sprung up and become very prominent. You know, it's been around for years, but now it's very prominent across the media, across, you know, Twitter, and this is basically a conspiracy theory that organizations like Media Matters for America have been tracking very diligently. A conspiracy theory that basically asserts that a deep state, you know, cabal within the Trump administration is working to subvert Trump, and it's connected to all kinds of child sex trafficking scandals and all kinds of other conspiracy theories. When you dig beneath the surface and you ask QAnon supporters, who are some of these deep state elites? Well, it's George Soros, it's the Rothschilds, it's, you know, pretty quickly the anti-Semitic, you know, element of this conspiracism becomes manifest. And, you know, these kind of conspiracies, you know, cut across broad swaths of you know, race and in some cases class differences in America. They aren't only, you know, believed by, you know, folks who show up to reopen protests, though you'll certainly see them more there. There's a lot of overlap with, you know, anti-government movements, some white nationalist movements, other far-right movements, and these conspiracy theories kind of take on a life of their own and can be believed by, you know, by a diverse spectrum of folks right now. And it just goes to show that in climates of uncertainty and in stability, like, you know, the one we live in, where many people are rightfully, you know, convinced that they are politically powerless and that there are a lot of special interests at play who exert disproportionate power. That's a rife environment for conspiracy theories to become manifest across the political spectrum. And it's an area that all of our work touches on in various ways. Yeah.
We are over time, but I'm going to take a few minutes to raise up a couple questions from the chat while we have you as captive audience. Heather writes about worrying that being for Hong Kong students and independence might look to some like anti-Chinese sentiment. Similarly, PRA Stephen Gardner follows up on that question and how do we distinguish between a principled critique of Chinese policies and the kind of anti-Chinese bigotry conspiracy theories we are seeing so much of?
Yeah, so I am highly critical of the Chinese government. I have a lot of friends and comrades from Hong Kong. I'm Cantonese on my father's side of my family, and have had like relatives in Hong Kong. And I've also been very concerned about the state of organizers in mainland China. This doesn't get talked about as much, but there has been like vibrant labor movements and feminist movements in mainland China, and they all suffer from this similar forms of repression. I think what important ways to distinguish to like have a proper critique of what's happening in Hong Kong and elsewhere is like a good starting point is to avoid exoticizing it and seeing it as something that is somehow uniquely Chinese. What we're seeing in these authoritarian repressive policies in China are part of a global trend in a rise of repression, authoritarianism, and right-wing nationalism that we see all over the place, including in the United States. So if you have a critique of what's happening in Hong Kong that connects the dots between what the Indian government is doing, or what the Filipino government is doing, or the crackdowns on protesters that we have seen here in the United States, I think that is a good starting point for having like a proper critique that isn't racist and seeing this as this exotic feature of this like racialized other. I think another important thing coming out of that critique is to be very critical about the idea that anti-China policies from the US government are going to do anything to solve the situation. I think what we've seen is the opposite, that these aggressive moves against the Chinese government from the US government have done nothing to protect Hong Kong protesters or to protect rights and democracy in Hong Kong, and have actually, in many ways, made it worse.
Thank you. Thank you all. Toby, Cloee, Ben, this was really fascinating, really interesting to hear how right-wing actors and rhetoric are interacting with this fairly unique moment that we're in. We are at time, so I do encourage audience members to reach out to individual panelists to follow up with your questions and thoughts. I will also mention that we have our final webinar of the series in 2 weeks on authoritarianism. You all will be receiving emails about that. And in regards to Chloe's presentation, we are releasing a map that has comprehensive data on American sheriffs and their affiliations with anti-immigrant and right-wing networks towards the end of this month, beginning of next month. So I encourage you all to stay tuned for a real resource that can really guide us. Thank you again, all. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you, audience members, for joining us, and we hope you stay tuned for our next webinar.